Hello and welcome to the Phuket Stories podcast. I'm your moderator, Saigon Steve. On this special podcast episode, we'll talk with military personnel who were stationed in Vietnam and talk with them about their extraordinary experiences. This podcast is pre-recorded, but you're invited to participate on future podcasts by emailing your contact information to PhuketStories@gmail.com. That's PhuketStories@gmail.com. So let's get started with today's special guest. We are talking with Doug Davis. Doug Davis was with the 37th Security Police Squadron at Phuket from 1968 to 1969. Doug was a dog handler who patrolled the perimeter with his companion sentry dog, a German Shepherd K-9 named Smoke. Doug and Smoke spent many dangerous nights protecting us from the enemy, and we are grateful to hear his story today. Doug, you joined the Air Force back in 1966. Tell me why.
Well, I got to my sophomore year of college and had a little bit too much fun and was asked to leave. And I was a high draft number, and I went to the Navy and the Air Force because I didn't want to go into the Army. And the Air Force had an opening, and I took that, and I figured I would not go to Vietnam in any way. I just didn't know what was going to happen. And fortunately, I did end up in K-9. It's probably the best thing that's ever happened to me.
So, Doug, when you joined the Air Force and you went to Lackland Air Force Base like all of us did, you went through basic training. Tell me what happened after basic training.
After basic, I went immediately to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base and was in the Air Police. And I didn't go to tech school. They were shipping people out so quickly. The tech schools were full that I did on-the-job training at Seymour Johnson and graduated rather than being in tech school, but they're on the base.
What was your duties at Seymour Johnson?
After I graduated from on-the-job training, I worked the main gate and the back gate to Seymour Johnson, and then started riding patrol. And I did that for about 60 days, and I just didn't like the attitude of a lot of the law enforcement troops. So after 60 days, I went in and volunteered to go to security, and I spent one night walking around a squadron of F-100s, and I said that this is not my dream job. And the only other place to go was K-9, so I volunteered for K-9 the next day.
So what happens when you volunteer for K-9? Where do you take your training with the K-9?
Well, the first thing that happened when I said I wanted out of security and went to K-9, the squadron commander called me in and he said, "You realize what you're going to do. You're going to go to Vietnam. You're going to be out in the wilderness and outside in the bush." And he said, I think you should reevaluate this. And I said, no. I said, I'd rather have a dog than be in a bunker with the snakes and all the other things that run around over there, or being in a tower in a fixed location. So he approved it, and I did on-the-job training again at Seymour Johnson through the kennels, and the NCOIC of the kennels taught me. And about 3 months later, there was an opening back down at Lackland, the Medina Air Base, and I went there for 2 months of training and trained a sentry dog named Mike, and then rotated back to Seymour Johnson with Mike.
So your duties as a security police officer were training the dogs, and of course, it's a whole different world. Rather than training with other soldiers, it's you and the dogs, and they have to learn about you. You have to learn about them.
Yes, very well-educated system. They have, of course, they've been training dogs since World War II, and you started with getting in on the dog, working with the dog, getting used to them. They get used to you, and then you start with obedience, and then it leads in to aggression training, and at the same time, basically the scouting, which you'd alert on something, and the dog would take you into whoever was hiding in the bushes or behind rocks, and they'd jump out and wave their arms and get the dog all excited, and that was their big fun is finding something. So that's how they trained the dog to alert and to attack.
So the day comes, and you get orders for Phuket. Tell me about that.
What we all knew, security, law enforcement, or dog handlers, we all knew we were going to Vietnam. And I didn't know whether I was going to go with Mike or get a dog in country. And when I left Seymour Johnson, I left Mike, which he picked up another handler there, and Mike and the other handler ended up at Utapao about 4 months later in Thailand. I flew into Cam Ranh, flew to Quy Nhon, and then took a bus with all our barbed wire in the windows and got to Phuket, and took a day or two to check in, and then went to the kennels, and that's when they told me that I was going to handle a dog named Smoke, and that was the beginning of our year together.
So when they drove you through the main gate at Phuket, what crossed your mind?
I was tired, like everybody. We've been up for a day and a half, and I just wanted to get to a place where I could hit the rack and take it easy for the night, and then wake up in the morning and do what I had to do to get checked in, and then get out to the kennels.
So they take you to the kennel, and they introduce you to Smoke, right?
Yep. Went through the administrative stuff, and went through the armory and the kennels itself, and then they took me out to Smoke, and we spent that day and the next day I got him out of the run, and we went down and worked in the training area on leash and spent a couple of days, and then I let him off leash to let him run and play and do whatever he wanted. And then the day after that, we started to work obedience training and aggression and all that again.
Did it work good right from the beginning? Did you know this was going to be a good match?
Yeah. He trained me. He'd been in country a year, and the K-9, like I said earlier, you knew your job, the dog knew theirs, and it's just if you get paired up and you get along in the beginning, it's much easier, which Smoke and I did. And from that point forward, we both knew what to do, except I had not been out on post, which was, of course, a very scary situation in my mind mentally. But that came, and we did that for a year, and that just the beginning of my year with Smoke.
What was it like when they take you out to the perimeter the first time?
It's rather exciting, but they take you and you walk out from the kennels and go around the first 2 or 3 posts with the other handler behind you, and you just start to get the feel for the area, and you do that for a night or two in different locations of the base, and then you're on your own.
So when you say you go to a post, is that some kind of a structure, or is it just an area designated for your post?
It's an area designated. It may be a quarter of a mile, a third of a mile, half a mile wide. And at Phuket, 65-70% was outside the wire. So you'd be outside the wire, and you could go out pretty much as far as you wanted to. So you had a lot of area to work, and that's how you started, and that's how you went through the whole year.
Are the patrols just at nighttime, or are they 24/7?
Just at night, although when there was any type of firefight or any time they thought there may be any VC or NVA, they did have a dog team run point during day, which was really, for a sentry dog, was absolutely useless because they're really only used to working at night.
What's it like out there during the monsoon season?
It's pretty wet because as soon as you stop, your dog's up under the poncho with you, and you try to find a place that the wind's really blowing hard You try to find either a tree or something to break the wind. And the exciting part of that is you're not only looking for high ground with your dog, but so are the snakes. So that was another exciting part of the year.
So are you going to the same post every night, or is it a different post every night?
There were 38 working posts, and you changed every night. And a lot of times, once you'd been in country a while, you tried to have handlers that you were familiar with near you or on the next post, because you all seem to be able to work together and know how that dog team works, and they know how you work. So you tried to stay together with other handlers that you knew.
So you're out there in the bush. It's not like walking in a pathway. There's no roadways. Everything is jungle. Is that the way it looks outside the perimeter?
The majority of it was jungle. We did have a lot of rice paddies that we'd go through. Part of the problem with the jungles is there were a lot of old water wells that had been out there for centuries. And you always followed your dog, two reasons. Number one was snakes. Number two were water wells. And once you got used to the post, you knew where those wells were. Because if you fell in one, you were in big trouble.
So how does this work when it's total darkness? There's no moon out, not a light evening. How do you see in front of you?
It's more of a sixth sense, and you follow your dog. The dog's the leader. He's the guy driving the bus.
Interesting. Now, I understand that Smoke had some behavior positions that he did when he came across something. They were different for the enemy, different for animals, different for tripwires and things of that nature. Tell me about that.
The tripwires we usually did not run into because they were designated areas, and we just never really ran into tripwires. But when Smoke alerted on an animal, he weaved more. In a short period of time, you could figure that out. But when he alerted on an NVA or a VC, the ball game was on. And it was your duty to go out and find where they were and then call in help before you got to them, if you could tell, which by the strength of the alert, you could tell when you're getting closer, and try to eliminate the enemy or make sure they got back off the base.
So did you have equipment that told your longitude and latitude?
Nope. It's time and country. You'd work the post, you get used to them, you call something in. Other handlers that had been in country for more than 3 or 4 months knew exactly where you were at. There was mentally that, it'd pop up in their mind, and we had a strike team or the other handlers that were on the right or left-hand side of you would come to help. The only problem with the handlers on each other side of you, then you're leaving the perimeter open in that area. So you try to get to a point where the strike team, which was 3 K-9 handlers, would come out in the Jeep on the perimeter, and then they'd go through the wire and try to get to you. And it took quite a bit of time for somebody to get to you for help.
So you're basically out in the jungle like Rambo. You're not out there with a headband and a shirtless with a bow and arrow and all of that, but you're out there by yourself with Smoke, and it's you against the enemy.
Well, that's true. That's it. We were expensive cannon fodder, and it was not just me. It was every other handler at our base and everywhere in country. It could get exciting at times, and I sure learned how to be scared. You could swear when you get close to where you thought the enemy was that they could hear your heartbeat, and it's your duty to make sure that you could radio so the handlers to the left and the right or central security control knew where you were, because a lot of times they would not just pick one penetration point. They'd pick 2 or 3, and there could be 2 of the enemy or there could be 5, and they'd do whatever they could to get in. And at Phuket, the main place they tried to get to was the bomb dump, which was on the north side. Because if they could ignite that baby could probably blow up for a week.
But they didn't want you to engage the enemy, did they? Just you and the dog. You had to call in for the help, right?
Right. Well, and the other thing that we learned how to do is when we thought we were close, we'd call the mortar crews, and they would fire. They'd start with illumination. You learned how to call in for HE or for explosives and try to get as close as you could to try to drive them out. Because once they knew they'd been detected, they tried to get out of there if they were far enough out on the perimeter. If they were up close to the base, then they would try to get in as far as they could. But once we had the perimeter completely manned with K-9, which was pretty much true of every base, they never made it past K-9.
Doug Davis, you told me before we started the podcast there was a behavior situation with Smoke where fire ants were climbing onto him, and he did a kind of a strange move. Tell me about that.
It wasn't a strange move. If you ever had fire ants on, you know it. It was a night we'd gone out through the wire. We were on the north side. I think it was on Kilo 13. We been out about 5-7 minutes, and I stopped for a second for something, and I noticed Smoke danced a little bit, and there were ants, and he was in them, and I took my leash and I jerked it as hard as I could to pull him out of there real quick, and all of a sudden the lead went over my head and landed behind me, and the ball and socket where the clip was that went on the collar or the chain had worn so much that when I jerked it, it came out, which I was shocked because we agitated those dogs every day, and if another handler would agitate him and that thing would come loose, he'd have nailed the other handler. Anyway, I took Smoke, and I was not real happy because I had to go all the way back up to the perimeter, go back in the wire, and they brought a leash out. And a new leash is a pain in the rear because, it cuts in your arms and everything. But 2 days later, another handler, which was on Kilo 11, caught an NVA lieutenant. And the next morning when they went through interrogation, he came by and he says, "Davis, you're the luckiest guy on the face of the earth." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "There was a squad of NVA, and this lieutenant was with them, and they were just ready to blow you away, and they saw you had an equipment problem and went back to the base." So I guess somebody was with me that night.
That was a blessing in disguise. Doug, you were exposed to Agent Orange being out there. Did you get any effects from that?
Yes. All of us in the K-9 section, all of us that are still alive, it's surprising. Of course, I guess we're not kids anymore. We've all had pretty much the same sequence of events, from different cancers to just different items, and it sounds like it's all related to Agent Orange. But the guys that were there after me, they were exposed to quite a bit more because they literally leveled the perimeter. They hit it with Agent Orange very heavily, and then they dozed everything down. So there was no more jungle, there was no more anything, and I really don't know how in the hell you go out and work in the middle of that, and the guys weren't very happy about working out there.
So eventually the day comes, 1969. You've been there a year, and you have to say goodbye to Smoke. What was that like?
We'd had just shy of a year, we'd had 3 nights of heavy penetration, and there was a firefighter or 2 on the north, and I was on the north side that night again. And they held Sergeant Brown and I over to lead point for security strike teams. And it was horrible. Sentry dogs weren't meant to work during the day. Plus, Smoke had been working for 3 days straight, nonstop, pulling, and there was a lot going on. So it was, 0800 or 0830. Brown and I left. He was off to my right. I was to the north. And we got to a hedgerow, and I went through, and it'd been about 100 yards. And there was a wounded NVA. And at that point, I had done my job. I found him. I got Smoke, got back to the hedgerow, reported to the strike team, and they captured him. And so I went back to the kennels, put Smoke, he had worked so hard, his pads were bleeding. So I put him in the sick kennels, which, by the way, was where we cleaned our weapons. And I put him in the last run, and I cleaned my weapon, and I turned around and looked at him. And he looked at me and turned his head. He cocked his head. And I looked at him, and that second, I knew I'd never seen him again. I walked out of the kennels, and I passed out. And it turned out my appendix was ready to rupture. And I thought I felt bad from the adrenaline flowing for over 3 days. And they medevaced me out, and I never saw him again. They medevaced me to Quin Yon, took my appendix out, and I'd extended 6 months, and I was right at the year, so they shipped me back, went to Chanute Air Force Base, and from there went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
So what happened to Smoke after you left?
Smoke had another handler. I found this handler, I guess maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, and, you know, we did some email back and forth, and he said that he had, like me, he had really enjoyed working with Smoke and how good of a dog he was. He said one night Smoke got sick. He had to come back in to the kennels, and I think they flew to Ponsanute, where the main K-9 hospital was. And within 24 hours, he had a severe kidney infection, and they had to put him down within that 24 hours. So actually, in a way, he was fortunate he didn't end up, when we pulled out of country and they left all those dogs with, they euthanized them, even though they were healthy, or turned them over to the South Vietnamese.
Yes, I read somewhere that approximately 4,000 dogs served in Vietnam, and a couple hundred went to the States, and the rest of them they just euthanized.
Right. There were very few that came back. They treated them as excess equipment.
Terrible.
This isn't my story. It's every sentry dog, scout dog, or tracker's story that you're just hooked at the hip with your dog. And we all had the same dangers, the same joys. It was, all I can say is, it was a hell of a privilege being a dog head.
You do get attached to these dogs. How emotionally involved were you when you heard that Smoke had been euthanized?
Well, it had been years. You know, I wasn't really sure what had happened, and Vietnam Dog Handler Association not finally, but they had a way to find out what happened to your dog. And it was sad, but, you know, I knew he didn't come back to the world. He was, unfortunately, he wasn't that lucky to be brought back.
Doug Davis, you have a story about when you came back to the world and you adopted a dog named Remy. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I first adopted a dog named Ringo. We went to a Vietnam Dog Handlers reunion, and I got involved with the K-9 rescue, and I ended up with a dog named Ringo that was in Kuwait. He was a bomb patrol dog, and we were fortunate enough, he lived about 1.5 years, but he'd had some problems, and unfortunately we had to put him down. And after that, emotionally, my wife and I said, we can't take another dog. Well, the people at the K-9 rescue, all of a sudden I got a call, and they said, we're on our way to Traverse City with a dog for you. His name's Remy. And at the time, he was a contractor dog. And they said there were some pictures of his handler and just it's a little bit of information that he'd been in Afghanistan. Well, it turned out a lady here in Traverse City wrote an article. She didn't know anything about dog handlers in Vietnam or any of the military. And that I had adopted, this was the second dog I adopted. And it turned out that his handler, who had been looking for him for 8 years, looked on the internet one morning and found us and it turned out to be quite a story. He was quite a hero.
Well, talking about coincidences like that, a while back, I put up some videos on YouTube about Phuket, and if anybody wants to see them, they're on YouTube under the label Phuket Air Force Base 1968 to 1969. There's Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3. And Part 1 shows the K-9 area with the cages, and there was a soldier there who was demonstrating one of the K-9s going through the obstacle course, and I happened to film that, and I put that up on YouTube. Well, the person who saw it on YouTube was Vince DeGiulio, and he put on the YouTube, he said, "I'm the dog handler in this video series, the 37th Security Police K-9, January 569 to January 570. I was browsing for info on Phuket and came across this video. I'd completely forgotten. I'd been on post all night, and then after a couple of hours' sleep, was ordered to get to the kennels and to put on a dog demonstration. I never knew for who. You can imagine my surprise upon seeing myself in the video." And I told you about this, and you said, "I just spoke to Vince after many, many years a couple of months ago." Isn't that right?
Yes, sir. Vince is a good handler. And we had seen each other at a few reunions, dog handler reunions, and, time just flips away, and we contacted each other. It was about 2 months ago, and I was shocked when he told me it was Vince. It was small world.
Well, Doug Davis, we reached the end of the podcast, and I would like to thank you for being out there, keeping us safe at Phuket. We never took you guys for granted, but I don't think anybody really, except the people within your squadron, knew the dangers that you were going through every night, and having to go out into the jungle by yourself with the dog. It's just you and Smoke.
Well, like I said, it wasn't just me. It was every dog handler in country. We all did the same thing and all had the same job, and you got used to it. And as I said, the longer you were in country, the better you got.
Doug Davis, thank you for your service.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for yours.
Well, that wraps up another special episode of Phuket Stories. If you'd like to participate in a future Phuket Stories podcast, email your contact information to phuketstories@gmail.com. That's phuketstories@gmail.com. Until next time, thanks for listening to the Phuket Stories podcast. I'm Saigon Steve.